With nothing but a rusted key in her trembling hand and the echo of her husband's final words ringing in her ears, Eleanor Vance stood in the doorway of the life she thought she'd built, watching it vanish in a single, merciless afternoon, because just hours earlier, after 38 years of marriage, the man she had loved, trusted, and devoted her entire adult life to had looked her in the eye and calmly told her he had never loved her at all. And what made it worse, what shattered something deeper than heartbreak, was not just the confession itself but the cold, practiced way he delivered it, as if he had rehearsed it, as if their nearly 4 decades together had been nothing more than a script he was finally tired of performing. And Eleanor, who had spent years believing that love could grow quietly in the spaces between routine and responsibility, suddenly found herself questioning every shared meal, every holiday, every whispered goodnight, wondering if any of it had ever been real, because that morning had started like any other, with sunlight slipping through the curtains of the bedroom they had shared for decades, with the familiar creak of the floorboards as she walked to the kitchen, with coffee brewing and toast warming, with the small, ordinary rituals that had come to define her life. And she had even paused for a moment, as she sometimes did, to feel a quiet gratitude for the stability they had built together, never suspecting that by evening, that entire world would be gone, replaced by something unrecognizable and cruel. Because Daniel had come home earlier than usual that day, his expression distant, his movements deliberate, and when he asked her to sit down, there was something in his voice that made her stomach tighten in a way she couldn't explain, and they sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where they had once planned vacations and celebrated birthdays, where they had laughed and argued and lived. But this time, there was no warmth, no familiarity, just a strange, suffocating tension that filled the space between them. And when he finally spoke, his words were not angry or emotional, but measured and detached, as if he were discussing a business arrangement rather than dismantling a marriage. And he said, "Eleanor, I think it's time we stop pretending." And she frowned, confused, because pretending had never been a word she associated with their life. And when she asked him what he meant, that was when he said it. That was when he delivered the sentence that would fracture everything she believed about herself and her past. "I never loved you." And for a moment, the world seemed to tilt, as if gravity itself had shifted, and Eleanor actually let out a small, incredulous laugh because the statement was so absurd, so completely disconnected from the reality she thought she knew, that her mind refused to accept it. But Daniel didn't smile, didn't soften, didn't take it back. Instead, he continued, speaking in that same calm, almost clinical tone, explaining that he had stayed all these years out of convenience, that their marriage had been practical, stable, easy to maintain, that she had been dependable and kind and predictable, and that those qualities had made life comfortable, but not meaningful, not passionate, not real. And as he spoke, Eleanor felt something inside her begin to unravel, not all at once, but slowly, thread by thread, as if the foundation of her identity was being quietly pulled apart. And she tried to interrupt, tried to ask questions, tried to find some crack in his story that would make it less final, less devastating. But there was none, because he had already made his decision long before this conversation. And this moment was not a discussion but a declaration. And then came the practical details, the things that felt almost more brutal than the confession itself, because they revealed just how carefully he had planned his exit, how thoroughly he had prepared to erase her from the life they shared. As he explained that the house was legally in his name, that the savings accounts and investments had been structured in ways she had never questioned, that everything she had assumed was theirs was, in fact, his, and Eleanor sat there, stunned, realizing that the trust she had given so freely had left her completely exposed, completely unprotected. And she thought about the years she had spent managing the home, supporting his career, putting aside her own ambitions because they had agreed that one stable path was enough for both of them. And now she understood that while she had been building a life, he had been building an escape. And when she finally found her voice, it came out quieter than she expected, asking him how he could say these things after so many years, how he could reduce their entire marriage to something so empty. And he simply shrugged, as if the answer were obvious, as if feelings, or the absence of them, required no justification, and said, "Because it's the truth." And there was something about That word, truth, that cut deeper than anything else, because it implied that everything before this moment had been a lie. And as the afternoon wore on, the conversation shifted from emotional devastation to logistical finality, with lawyers mentioned, timelines outlined, expectations set, and Eleanor found herself nodding mechanically, absorbing information she didn't fully process, because her mind kept returning to that one sentence, replaying it over and over again as if repetition might somehow make it less real. But it didn't. It only made it sharper, clearer, more inescapable, and by evening, Daniel had packed a suitcase and left, moving through the house with an efficiency that felt almost rehearsed, as if he had already detached himself from every memory contained within those walls. And Eleanor remained behind, standing in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the remnants of a life that no longer belonged to her. And it was only later, when she began the painful process of sorting through drawers and closets, deciding what little she could take, that she found the key, tucked away in the back of an old wooden drawer, small and rusted and oddly heavy for its size. And there was something about it that felt significant, something that made her pause despite everything else collapsing around her. And when Daniel saw it in her hand, his reaction was immediate and uncharacteristically sharp, telling her she didn't need it, that it was nothing, that she should leave it behind. But the urgency in his voice told her the opposite, told her that this small, forgotten object mattered in a way she didn't yet understand. And so she slipped it into her pocket without another word, not knowing that this rusted key, this single overlooked detail, would become the only thing connecting her to a truth far greater than the one that had just destroyed her life. And as night fell and she sat alone in the house that was no longer hers, Eleanor Vance realized that she was not just losing a marriage. She was losing the story she had told herself about who she was. And in its place, something unknown and uncertain was beginning to take shape. Something that started with a key and a question she couldn't yet answer. The rusted key didn't make sense at first, and for several days after Eleanor left the house that had defined 38 years of her life, it remained nothing more than a cold, unanswered question in the pocket of her coat, pressing faintly against her palm whenever she reached for the few coins she had left. But questions, she would soon learn, have a way of growing louder in silence. And in the small, dimly lit room she rented above a hardware store in a town where no one knew her name, the absence of everything she had lost made that one small object impossible to ignore, because there was nothing left to distract her, no routines to follow, no shared spaces to maintain, no familiar voice filling the quiet. Only the steady ticking of time and the weight of realization settling deeper with each passing hour. And it was in that quiet that her mind began to return, again and again, not just to Daniel's words, but to his reaction when he saw the key. Because in a day filled with cold detachment, that had been the only moment he showed anything resembling urgency, the only moment his carefully controlled composure had slipped, and that meant something, even if she didn't yet understand what. And so one evening, as rain tapped softly against the narrow window, and the faint hum of the shop below seeped through the floorboards, Eleanor sat down at the small table in her room, placed the key in front of her, and began to study it as if it were a puzzle waiting to be solved, turning it slowly between her fingers, noticing details she had missed before, the uneven edges worn smooth with age, the faint discoloration of metal exposed to time. And then, when she angled it just right under the weak overhead light, she saw it. A marking so subtle it could easily have been overlooked, 2 small letters and a date etched near the base, nearly erased by years of neglect, but still there, stubbornly holding on. LM, 1986. And something about that date struck her immediately, not because it was significant on its own, but because of where it fell in the timeline of her life. 1 year before she married Daniel. 1 year before everything she believed her life to be had begun. And with that realization came something else, a memory she had buried so deeply she hadn't thought of it in decades, a moment so small at the time it had seemed insignificant, but now returned with unsettling clarity, a letter she had once found tucked inside one of Daniel's books, addressed to him in handwriting she didn't recognize, signed only with initials, LM, and she remembered asking him about it, remembered the way he had dismissed it with casual ease, telling her it was nothing, just someone from the past, someone who didn't matter, and she had believed him, because at that time, she had no reason not to. But now, sitting alone in a room that felt more like a waiting space than a home, she realized how many things she had accepted without question, how many explanations she had taken at face value simply because they came from someone she trusted. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that the life she thought she had entered all those years ago had already been built on something unfinished, something unresolved. And the key in front of her was not random, not meaningless, but a fragment of that unfinished story. And once that thought took hold, it refused to let go, pushing her towards something she hadn't expected. Not grief, not anger, but curiosity, a quiet, persistent need to understand what had been hidden from her and why. And so over the next few days, Eleanor began to search, not with any clear plan, but with a determination that surprised even her. Visiting the local library, asking cautious questions, sifting through public records and old newspapers, following small threads of information that seemed insignificant on their own, but gradually began to form a pattern. And it wasn't easy, because time had a way of erasing details, of softening edges and blurring connections. But Eleanor had patience, something she had cultivated over years of quiet endurance, and eventually, a name surfaced, one that matched the initials on the key: Lydia Mercer, a woman who had lived on the outskirts of town decades ago, a woman whose name appeared briefly in property records before disappearing entirely. And there was something about that disappearance that felt incomplete, as if her story had ended without explanation. And when Eleanor found an old listing tied to that name, an address attached to a piece of land long since forgotten, she felt a strange certainty settle over her, the kind that doesn't come from logic, but from something deeper, something instinctive. And despite the hesitation that flickered briefly in her mind, she knew she had to go, because whatever the key unlocked, it was not just a door but a truth. And that truth had been hidden from her for nearly 4 decades, and she could no longer pretend she didn't want to find it. And so one gray afternoon, with the key in her pocket and a growing sense of purpose guiding her steps, Eleanor made her way to the edge of town, following a narrow road that gradually gave way to overgrown paths and quiet stretches of land untouched by time, until finally, she saw it. A house that looked less like a place someone had lived and more like something the world had forgotten. Its structure worn and weathered, windows clouded with dust, the surrounding yard reclaimed by nature in slow, deliberate ways. And for a moment, she simply stood there, taking it in, feeling the weight of everything that had led her to this point pressing against her chest. Because this place, whatever it was, whatever it held, was connected to the life she had lived without ever fully understanding. And as she approached the door, her steps slow but steady, she reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the rusted key, feeling its familiar weight grounding her in the present. And there was a brief moment of doubt, a fleeting thought that she could turn back, that she could leave this question unanswered and continue forward without reopening the past. But that thought faded almost as quickly as it came, replaced by something stronger, something that had been building since the moment Daniel told her the truth, a refusal to remain in the dark any longer. And so, without giving herself time to hesitate again, Eleanor lifted the key, aligned it with the lock, and turned it. And as the mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed far too loud in the stillness around her, she realized that whatever waited on the other side of that door was not just about Daniel, not just about Lydia Mercer, but about her, about the life she had lived and the truth she was finally ready to face, no matter how much it changed everything she thought she knew. The moment the door opened, Eleanor expected to feel something dramatic: anger, grief, maybe even a sense of closure. But what met her instead was something far quieter and far more unsettling, a stillness that seemed to hold the weight of years left unresolved, as if the house itself had been waiting, not for Daniel, not even for Lydia Mercer, but for someone willing to finally see what had been hidden inside it. And as Eleanor stepped across the threshold, the air thick with dust and memory, she realized that this was not the end of a story but the beginning of one she had never been allowed to know, because everything inside spoke of a life interrupted, not abandoned, furniture arranged with intention, books stacked carefully on a shelf, a shawl draped over the back of a chair as if its owner had only just stepped away. and that detail alone unsettled her more than anything else, because it suggested that Lydia Mercer hadn't planned to leave, hadn't chosen to disappear, and as Eleanor moved slowly through the space, her fingers brushing against surfaces untouched for decades, she felt a growing sense that this house held answers not just about Lydia, but about the man who had built a life with her while burying another one entirely. And it didn't take long to find the proof, because in a small wooden box tucked near the fireplace, hidden but not lost, she discovered the letters, dozens of them, tied together with a fading ribbon, their edges worn but their contents preserved in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if they had been meant to be found one day. And when she opened the first one and saw Daniel's handwriting, there was no shock left in her, only a quiet confirmation of what she already knew, that the truth had been there all along, just out of reach. And as she read, the story unfolded in fragments that slowly formed a complete picture, a love that had once been intense and consuming, promises made with certainty, plans for a future that had never come to pass. And then, gradually, a shift, hesitation creeping into his words, excuses replacing intentions, until finally there was only silence, an absence that said more than any explanation could. And in the last unfinished letter, the one that trailed off mid-sentence, Eleanor saw the moment everything had changed, the moment Daniel had chosen a different path, not out of love, but out of convenience, leaving one life behind to construct another. And for a long time, Eleanor simply sat there, the letters spread around her, the weight of the truth settling into something steady and undeniable. Because this was not just betrayal, not just the collapse of a marriage, it was the realization that she had been living in the shadow of a decision made long before she entered the picture, a replacement for something unfinished, a solution rather than a choice. And yet, as that realization took hold, something unexpected began to rise alongside it. Not bitterness, not even anger, but a strange, clarifying sense of freedom. Because if the life she had built had never truly been hers, then losing it did not mean losing herself. It meant being released from something that had never fully belonged to her in the first place. And that shift, subtle but powerful, changed everything. Because for the first time since Daniel's confession, Eleanor was not thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what remained. And what remained was this house, this story, this truth that had been hidden for decades and was now, undeniably, hers to hold, hers to decide what to do with. And as the days turned into weeks, that decision began to take shape, not as a sudden revelation, but as a series of small, deliberate choices, returning to the house again and again, cleaning, restoring, uncovering more details of Lydia Mercer's life, piecing together who she had been and what had been taken from her. And in doing so, Eleanor found something she hadn't expected, a connection not built on shared experience but on shared absence. Two women separated by time but linked by the same man's unfinished truth. And rather than turning away from that connection, Eleanor leaned into it, choosing not to erase Lydia's presence but to preserve it, to give it the recognition it had been denied. And when she discovered that the property had no clear legal owner, that it had slipped through records and been quietly forgotten, she made another choice, one that would define the next chapter of her life. She claimed it, not as a replacement for what she had lost, but as something entirely new, something she would build on her own terms. And the process was not easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But Eleanor had already endured the hardest part, the breaking of illusions, the dismantling of a life she thought was permanent. And compared to that, rebuilding felt almost simple, because it was honest, every step forward grounded in truth rather than assumption. And as the house slowly transformed, repaired piece by piece, it became more than just a place to live. It became a space of intention, a reflection of the life she was choosing to create. And over time, that intention expanded beyond herself, because Eleanor understood that she was not the only one who had been left behind, not the only one who had been made to feel disposable. And so she opened the doors, first cautiously, then with growing confidence, to others who needed a place to start over. Women carrying their own versions of loss, betrayal, and displacement. Women who had been told, in one way or another, that they were no longer needed. And in that shared space, something remarkable began to take shape. Not just healing, but renewal, a quiet reclaiming of identity that did not depend on anyone else's choices. And Eleanor, who had once defined herself entirely within the boundaries of a marriage, now stood at the center of something she had built herself, something rooted not in illusion but in truth. And years later, as she stood on the porch watching the light fade across the land that had once been forgotten, she reached into her pocket and held the rusted key one last time, no longer as a symbol of what had been hidden from her, but as a reminder of what she had uncovered, because that key had not just opened a door, it had opened her eyes, and in doing so, it had given her something far more valuable than the life she had lost. It had given her ownership of her own story, and this time, there was no one left who could take that away from her.